On May 5, 1945, the order came down to get off the escarpment. The fighting on Okinawa had turned the Madeira Ridge into a killing ground. Japanese fire swept the top of the cliff, and the wounded were piling up faster than they could be moved. When the call to withdraw was given, most of the regiment went over the edge on ropes, one by one. Desmond T. Doss did not. He had already been wounded. He had no weapon, night was coming, and the enemy was still there. Above the cliff, men were still alive. They could not move. If Doss went down, they would be left behind. So while the battle moved away from him, Doss stayed on the ridge alone, dragging wounded men to the edge and lowering them to safety, one at a time, under fire. For him, the retreat was not finished. A combat medic exists at the edge of the fight, close enough to danger to matter, but never positioned to control it. Their role is defined by limitation. Medics do not command troops. They do not shape maneuvers. Their purpose is narrower and more immediate. Keep the wounded alive long enough to reach someone else. During World War II, U.S. Army medics were classified as non-combatants under the Geneva Convention. They carried medical bags instead of heavy weapons, marked themselves with red crosses, and were expected to move with their units, not ahead of them. Their protection came from proximity and momentum. As long as the unit advanced or withdrew together, the medic had a measure of safety. Training emphasized speed and triage. Stop bleeding, clear airways, treat shock, stabilize and move. Medics were not taught to fight for ground or hold positions. Doctrine was explicit. A medic who stayed too long risked becoming a casualty himself, adding to the problem rather than solving it. This is why withdrawal orders matter so much to medics. When a unit pulls back, the medic is expected to pull back with it. The wounded who can move go first. The medic follows. Those who cannot move are evacuated if possible, and if not, commanders are forced to make decisions no one wants to make. Medics understand this calculus better than anyone. A dead medic cannot treat tomorrow's wounded. A trapped medic ties up manpower and resources. Staying behind is not framed as courage in training manuals. It is framed as failure of timing. And yet, combat does not follow manuals. Terrain collapses evacuation plans. Fire makes movement impossible. Wounded men cannot always be carried without killing them. In those moments, the medic's role shifts from mobility to endurance. What begins as doctrine ends as judgment. The medic must decide whether leaving preserves the mission or whether staying preserves something more immediate, the life in front of him. Every medic who has ever refused to leave crosses this line knowing exactly what doctrine says. They cross it because reality leaves no other option. By the spring of 1945, the fight for Okinawa had settled into a grinding battle of attrition. The Madeira Escarpment, soon known to the men of the 77th Infantry Division as Hacksaw Ridge, was a sheer limestone cliff rising nearly 400 feet above the battlefield. To reach the Japanese defensive positions on top, American infantry had to climb cargo nets and rope ladders under fire, crest the edge, and fight forward across open ground with little cover. Desmond Doss was there as a medic, not an infantryman. He carried no weapon. He never had. His job was to follow the rifle companies up the cliff and do what medics always did, treat the wounded fast enough to keep them alive until evacuation could happen. On May 5th, the Japanese counterattacked in force. Mortars and machine guns swept the top of the ridge. Infantry units were cut apart. Casualties mounted rapidly, and the situation deteriorated until the order came down to withdraw. These men began climbing back down the escarpment, lowering themselves to safety as best they could while under fire. Doss was already wounded when the withdrawal began. Shrapnel had torn into his leg, and he had been hit again by a rifle butt during the chaos. By doctrine, he should have gone down with the others. He did not. As the riflemen pulled back, Doss stayed on top of the ridge with the wounded who could not move. He dragged men across open ground while fire cracked overhead, pulling them toward the cliff edge. There was no organized evacuation left, no litter teams, no covering fire, just the medic and the wounded he refused to abandon. Working alone, Doss improvised a system. He tied a rope around each wounded man, eased them over the edge of the escarpment, and lowered them hand over hand until they reached troops below. Each descent took time. Each descent exposed him again. When one man was lowered, he went back for another. This went on for hours. Night fell, Japanese forces were still active. Doss remained on the ridge, moving from casualty to casualty, treating wounds, dragging bodies, and lowering men down the cliff one at a time. According to after-action accounts, he prayed quietly between rescues, asking for the strength to save just one more. By the time he finally went down himself, an estimated 75 wounded men had already been evacuated because he stayed. The exact number would always be debated, but the result was not. Men who would have been left behind were alive because a medic refused to move when the order came. Doss did not describe his actions as extraordinary. He insisted he was only doing his duty. But what happened on Hacksaw Ridge illustrated the line medics sometimes cross without hesitation. Doctrine said move, survival said leave, reality said stay. The ridge would be taken again later. The battle would continue. But for those hours on the escarpment, the war narrowed to a single purpose, keeping wounded men alive long enough to matter. That was enough for him to stay. By December of 1944, the town of Bastogne was surrounded. German forces had punched through the Ardennes and encircled the 101st Airborne Division in what would become the Battle of the Bulge. Roads were cut, supplies were scarce, evacuation was impossible. Snow and freezing temperatures turned every wound into a race against time. Eugene Rowe was assigned to Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He was not a dramatic figure. He did not make speeches or seek attention. He carried what little medical gear he had and moved between foxholes, treating men who were freezing, bleeding, or both. Rowe's greatest enemy was not gunfire, but exposure. Morphine ran out quickly, plasma was scarce and often frozen solid. Bandages stiffened in the cold. Men lay wounded in open positions because moving them risked killing them outright. The usual rhythm of treatment and evacuation did not exist. If a medic stayed, it was because there was nowhere else to go. As artillery pounded the perimeter and infantry attacks probed constantly, Rowe stayed forward with the wounded instead of falling back to relative safety. When positions were shelled, he moved through fire and snow to reach injured men, often crawling to avoid drawing attention. At times, he had nothing to offer but reassurance and pressure on wounds that would not stop bleeding. At one point, Rowe himself was suffering from trench foot so severe he could barely walk. His feet were swollen, numb, and cracked. By doctrine, he should have evacuated when the opportunity arose. He refused. He remained with the company because leaving would have meant abandoning men who were already barely surviving the cold. What Rowe did not know was how long the siege would last. Resupply was uncertain. Relief was a rumor. Every night felt like it could be the one where the perimeter collapsed. Still, he stayed forward, checking positions, treating the wounded where they lay, and doing what little could be done to keep men alive until morning. When the skies finally cleared and Allied aircraft dropped supplies into Bastogne, Rowe was still there. Only then did he allow himself to be pulled back for treatment. By that point, the worst of the crisis had passed. Rowe would later receive the Bronze Star for his actions, but like many medics, he did not frame what he did as exceptional. He stayed because evacuation was impossible, and because the wounded needed someone where they were. At Bastogne, refusing to leave did not mean defying an order. It meant recognizing that there was no rear to fall back to. The line had closed around them, and survival depended on endurance rather than movement. For Rowe, staying was not a moment of decision. It was the only way the job could be done. In March of 1966, the war in Vietnam looked nothing like the frozen forests of Bastogne or the open ridges of Okinawa. The Yasha Valley was dense jungle, steep, wet, and claustrophobic. Visibility was limited to yards. Sound carried strangely. Movement was slow, exhausting, and never secure. Benny G. Adkins was the senior medic with the Detachment A-102, 5th Special Forces Group at Camp A Shaw. The camp was isolated, manned largely by U.S. Special Forces and South Vietnamese troops. When the North Vietnamese Army attacked on March 9th, the engagement did not resolve in minutes or hours. It lasted for days. From the opening moments of the assault, casualties mounted. Mortars and rockets struck inside the perimeter. Bunkers collapsed. Fighting positions were overrun and retaken repeatedly. Evacuation was impossible. The weather grounded aircraft, and enemy fire made landing zones untenable. What wounded there were would remain where they fell. Adkins moved constantly. He treated casualties in bunkers under fire, dragged wounded men to relative cover, and worked through the night with limited supplies. Within the first day, he was wounded himself, then wounded again. Shrapnel and debris tore into him as the perimeter shrank. By doctrine, Adkins should have been evacuated the moment aircraft became available. He refused. He continued to move between positions, treating Americans and South Vietnamese alike. When ammunition ran low, he fought. When casualties piled up, he treated. The roles blurred because the situation demanded it. As the days dragged on, Adkins' physical condition deteriorated. He was exhausted, bleeding, and in constant pain. Sleep came in fragments, if at all. Still, he remained operational, prioritizing the wounded who could still be saved and staying with those who could not be moved. On the final day, with the camp nearly overrun, Adkins helped organize a breakout. Even then, he continued treating wounded men during the withdrawal, refusing evacuation until the last possible moment. Only after others were cleared did he allow himself to be carried out. Adkins survived. Many around him did not. His actions during the defense of Camp Aw Shaw would eventually earn him the Medal of Honor, though it would not be awarded until decades later. The delay mattered less than the record itself. What makes Atkins' case stand out is not a single dramatic moment, but sustained refusal. He did not stay once, he stayed repeatedly, across multiple days, while wounded himself in a fight where there was no safe rear and no clear end. In the Aw Shaw Valley, refusing to leave was not about one decision under fire. It was about endurance, about continuing to function long after the body and doctrine said it was no longer reasonable. Atkins stayed because leaving would have ended the work before it was finished. By April of 1970, the Special Forces camp at Dak Sang sat under constant pressure. The camp guarded approaches into the Central Highlands and had already endured repeated attacks. The enemy knew the terrain. They knew the perimeter, and they knew that once the shooting started, evacuation would be uncertain at best. Gary Beekirch was serving as a medic with the 5th Special Forces Group when Dak Sang came under heavy assault on April 1st. Mortars and rockets slammed into the camp, collapsing bunkers and sending shrapnel through fighting positions. Almost immediately, men were wounded in exposed areas, where reaching them meant crossing open ground under fire. Beekirch had already moved casualties to relative cover when one of the most dangerous moments unfolded. A soldier lay wounded outside the perimeter, pinned down by enemy fire. Getting to him meant leaving the protection of the bunkers and crossing terrain that was being actively targeted. Beekirch went anyway. He reached the wounded man and began treatment while rounds impacted nearby. As he worked, he was hit himself, wounded by shrapnel. Even then he refused to leave. He continued treating the casualty until he could be moved, shielding him with his own body when fire intensified. Once the wounded man was clear, Beekirch was ordered to evacuate. He initially complied, moving towards safety. But when another casualty was reported in an exposed position, he turned back. He crossed the same fire-swept ground again, knowing full well what had already cost him. This time, the wounds were more severe. Beekirch was hit again while rendering aid, suffering injuries that would eventually force his evacuation. Even then, he delayed treatment for himself until others were stabilized. Unlike some cases, Beekirch's decision to stay is sharply defined. He had reached safety, he had followed the order to pull back. Then he reversed course and returned to the most dangerous area of the battlefield because someone was still alive and could not move. That return is the line. Beekirch survived his wounds. The men he treated survived because he went back. For his actions at Dak Sang, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation language is precise, but the reality behind it is simpler. He stayed because someone needed him where he was least protected. At Dak Sang, refusing to leave was not about being trapped or isolated. It was about choosing exposure when withdrawal was available. It was about stepping back into danger after already escaping it. For a medic, that choice carries a particular weight. Beekirch did not stay because he had no other option. He stayed because leaving would have meant abandoning work that was not finished. That distinction is why his story endures. The details differ, the terrain changes, the wars are separated by decades, but the decision each of these medics made follows the same pattern. None of them stayed because they misunderstood the danger. Desmond Doss knew exactly what remaining on Hacksaw Ridge meant. Eugene Rowe understood what exposure and exhaustion were doing to his body in Bastogne. Benny Atkins was wounded repeatedly and still refused evacuation. Gary Beekirch had already reached safety and turned back anyway. These were not impulsive acts, they were informed choices. In every case, evacuation was delayed, impossible, or incomplete. The wounded could not move without being killed. The medic was already committed, physically positioned, mentally focused, and morally anchored. Leaving would not have preserved order. It would have broken continuity. Another common thread is that none of these men framed their actions as extraordinary at the time. There was no internal debate about heroism. The question was practical and immediate. Is there still someone alive who needs help here? As long as the answer was yes, the medic stayed. These moments also reveal how doctrine bends under pressure. Military medicine is built around movement. Stabilize and evacuate. But when movement fails, endurance takes over. The medic's role shifts from facilitator to anchor, not because policy demands it, but because reality does. What stands out most is how narrow the decision becomes. The war does not disappear, but it recedes. Strategy, objectives, and timelines collapse into something smaller, a pulse, a breath, a wound that can still be treated. Everything else becomes secondary. Refusing to leave is often described afterward as courage. That word fits, but is incomplete. What these stories really show is judgment exercised under extreme conditions, not reckless bravery, but disciplined responsibility taken to its final limit. Each of these medics crossed the same line in different places and times. They did not do it to be remembered. They did it because, in that moment, staying was the only option that made sense. When the fighting ends, the medic's role does not resolve cleanly. There's no clear transition from crisis to normalcy. The work simply slows, then stops, often without ceremony. Adrenaline drains away, leaving fatigue and damage that had been ignored while others still needed help. For some medics, recognition followed. Medals were awarded, citations were written, the language was formal and precise, but it rarely captured the reality of what staying meant in the moment. For others, there was nothing official at all. No paperwork could account for decisions made in isolation, unseen by commanders or cameras. What lingered was not pride, but memory. The physical sensations remained vivid long after the details blurred. The weight of a body being dragged, hands cramped from pressure held too long, the sound of breathing that dictated every decision. These memories did not demand attention, but they did not fade easily either. Many medics returned to service and continued treating the wounded. Others left medicine entirely. Both paths were common. Staying once did not define a career, but it often defined a standard. Those who stayed learned something about themselves that could not be unlearned. Survivors sometimes reached out years later. Some found the medics who saved them. Others did not. Many never tried. Gratitude was difficult to express without reopening wounds that had long since scarred over. What mattered most to the medics was rarely the outcome beyond the battlefield. They measured success in immediate terms. Someone lived. Someone made it through the night. Someone went home who otherwise would not have. The shooting stopped. The war moved on. Life resumed in uneven steps. But the decision to stay did not disappear with the noise. It remained, quiet and permanent, carried by those who had made it. Across different wars, different terrain, and different generations, the moment is always the same. A unit moves, the battlefield shifts, someone is left behind who cannot move without help. For most soldiers, survival depends on following the order to withdraw. For the medic, survival sometimes depends on ignoring everything except the person in front of them. Desmond Doss stayed alone on a ridge because men were still alive above him. Eugene Rowe stayed in frozen foxholes because there was nowhere else to go. Benny Atkins stayed for days while wounded himself because evacuation was impossible. Gary Beekerts turned back after reaching safety because one more man needed help. None of them stayed to make a point. None of them stayed for recognition. They stayed because abandonment was a line they would not cross. Retreat can be necessary. Withdrawal can be unavoidable. But for these medics, leaving someone alive and untreated was never an option. As long as there was still a pulse to protect, the work was not finished. And until it was, they stayed. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
Oh, Dave.